For decades, the safe version of Australian prehistory said the oldest coastal evidence was gone, erased when the Ice Age seas rose. But in the Dampier archipelago, underwater stone tools have now forced that idea open. And by the end, the shoreline will not look like the edge of history anymore. This is the story of submerged and coastal ancient Australian structures rewriting prehistory, from Murujuga's drowned petroglyphs to sea country, not with myth, not with guesswork, with stone, dates, measurements, and places you can point to on a map. Picture a diver moving slowly over a submerged seabed. The water is green-grey. The sound is only breath through a regulator. Bubbles ticking upward, a hand brushing sand from a sharp-edged flake that should not be there by accident. In 2019, the Deep History of Sea Country project found underwater stone tools near Cape Bruguieres and Flying Foam Passage, and Cape Bruguieres gave up hundreds. Subscribe now, because the next part begins with the sea level rise that drowned an entire ancient coastline. To understand why those tools mattered, you have to move the coastline in your mind. At the height of the last ice age, the map of Australia was larger. The sea sat far lower than it does now. Then, after the glacial maximum, water rose by about 120 meters. Slowly in human terms, fast in geological terms. Bays filled, plains disappeared, old river mouths turned into channels of salt water. Imagine standing on land that is now seabed. The air would have carried dust, smoke, and the smell of tidal flats. Stone could be struck, carried, dropped, reused. Children could hear surf in the distance, while older people watched the line of water creep across places they knew. This is the key point. The drowned coast was occupied country. When the sea moved in, it did not erase the fact of human presence. It covered it. At Cape Bruguieres, under that moving water, the cover was not complete. At Cape Bruguieres, the evidence came from a place that no older map of archaeology had treated as a normal dig site. Researchers working with the Deep History of Sea Country project surveyed the seabed in 2019. Below the chop and glare of the water, they recorded hundreds of artefacts, stone pieces with edges, breaks, and forms that belonged to human work. The kind of material that, on dry land, would immediately pull archaeologists down to their knees. Now place that on the submerged seabed, sand moves under the current, seagrass bends and lifts, light breaks into strips across stone. Every object has to be judged carefully, because the sea can roll, chip and scatter rock, but the pattern at Cape Bruguieres held. This was once dry ground before post-Ice Age sea rise. People had used it. The ocean arrived later. Nearby at Flying Foam Passage, the same project found another clue under the water. Flying Foam Passage added a second point on the map, and that mattered. One underwater find can be treated as exceptional. Two sites, close to the same ancient coastal system, begin to change the shape of the question. The passage today is water, movement, boat noise, sunlight flashing hard off the surface. Below that, the seabed holds stone in a place that once belonged to a wider dry landscape. The implication is precise. Archaeologists were no longer only asking where people lived on the present coast. They were asking where the coast used to be before the sea climbed over it. That changes survey lines, it changes heritage boundaries, it changes what site even means. And just above these drowned places sits Murujuga on the Burrup Peninsula. Red-brown rock, heat rising from stone, iron-rich boulders packed with marks. There, the evidence does not come in hundreds. It comes in an estimated 1 million engravings. At Murujuga, the land record is so large that it changes the scale of the whole problem. Across the Burrup Peninsula, an estimated 1 million rock engravings sit on dark, iron-rich stone. Some are high on boulders warm enough to sting the palm, others lie lower, where dust gathers in cracks and the wind carries a dry mineral smell off the rock. The oldest engravings are estimated at up to 50,000 years old. That age matters. 50,000 years reaches far beyond the Egyptian pyramids, far beyond Stonehenge, beyond the first written cities. It places this coast inside one of the longest visual records of human life anywhere on Earth. The images record animals, bodies, tracks, movement, and changing country. Now the offshore finds add a second layer. Land above water holds the marks. Country below water holds the tools. So the question tightens. If the visible rocks preserve 1 million engravings, what did the rising sea cover beside them? That question is why Murujuga cannot be read as a dry land site alone. The present shoreline is recent compared with the age of the engravings. For thousands of years, people lived with a coast that moved. A camp near water in one generation could become a tidal flat in another. A stone source could shift from inland rise to beach edge to shallow floor under clear salt water. This is where sea country matters. It treats land and water as connected because the old human landscape did not stop at the line printed on a modern map. The smell of hot spinifex on the rocks, the slap of tide against mangrove roots, the dark boulders above the channel, they belong to one record. So the offshore tools are not an add-on to Murujuga. They extend the archive outward, and once that is accepted, the next issue becomes immediate. Who protects a record that sits partly on rock, partly underwater, and partly beside industry? The protection question becomes sharp on the Burrup Peninsula because the ancient record sits beside a modern industrial zone. Near Murujuga, acid emissions have been measured at about 34,000 tons per year. That figure matters because the engravings survive on rock surfaces. Their visibility depends on the skin of the stone, the dark outer layer, the contrast between pecked mark and weathered boulder. Stand there in the heat and the place feels tough. The rocks look heavy, permanent, almost impossible to harm, but stone surfaces change. Air moves across them, dust settles, moisture dries. Chemicals can alter the outer face grain by grain, year by year. For a landscape with marks estimated up to 50,000 years old, slow damage is still damage. When the same cultural system continues offshore, the risk is larger than one set of boulders. Because if the land record is under pressure now, what happens to the parts still being found underwater? The 2019 finds changed more than one local map. Before those surveys, the search for deep Australian history often favoured dry ground. Shelters, dunes, stone scatters, exposed rock. Those places still matter, but Cape Bruguieres and Flying Foam Passage proved that the old coast can be investigated underwater with archaeological care. The work is slower there. A diver cannot simply kneel and sift for hours like a trench team on land. Visibility shifts. Currents tug at measuring tapes. A tool can sit half-hidden under sand with shell grit clicking across it and the sound of a boat engine trembling through the water. Yet the evidence was recorded. Location, depth, stone, context. The submerged material entered the same argument as the engravings above shore. Heritage lines drawn only around dry land are already behind the evidence. If this is true beside Murujuga, then the next map is much larger, the drowned rim of Australia itself. From that larger map, Murujuga becomes a test case for the whole continent. Australia's present coast is only the latest edge. Around it lies a drowned belt of former land, Old plains, old creek lines, old stone sources, old places where people could have made tools, gathered food, watched tides, and marked country. After the sea rose about 120 meters, those places did not become irrelevant. They became harder to see. That is the correction. Ancient Australian structures, rewriting prehistory, are no longer only the ones standing in open air. Some sit in tidal zones, some are buried in sand, some lie below water where light turns blue and distance becomes uncertain. Murujuga gives the above-water archive. Cap Bruguieres and Flying Foam Passage give the underwater proof that coastal evidence can survive. Put them together, and the old consensus starts to fail from both directions, from the rock face above the tide and from the stone tools beneath it. That is where the evidence finally overturns the old frame. Murujuga gives the scale, an estimated 1 million engravings, with the oldest reaching up to 50,000 years. Cap Bruguieres gives the seabed proof, hundreds of artefacts on ground that was dry before the post-Ice Age sea rise. Flying Foam Passage adds the second underwater point. The wider coast gives the measurement, about 120 meters of rising sea, and the industrial zone gives the present risk, with acid emissions measured at about 34,000 tons per year. Put in order, those facts do not describe a vanished margin. They describe a record split by water, still readable in pieces. On the rocks, a pecked line catches the sun. Under the tide, a worked edge rests in moving sand. Between them is the old coastline, folded into the modern sea, waiting for careful hands, clear maps, and protection strong enough to match its age. If this changed how you picture Australia's ancient coast, stay with the channel and subscribe for the next deep history investigation.